Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into some fascinating material that I've been looking at about Shia militias in Iraq.
Yeah.
So we're going to be going beyond the headlines
Yeah.
to really understand their impact, their role in the fight against ISIS, the
Mhm.
challenges they create, and really what it means for Iraq's future.
I think that's important because so much of what we hear is just, good guys, bad guys, and there's so much more to it.
Absolutely. And the main source we'll be using today is a 2024 Investor article called Shia Militias in Iraq, Crucial Role in the Fight Against ISIS.
Okay.
And it's a complete story, so I'm really glad to have you here to help unpack it all.
Well, thanks for having me.
So to jump right in, I think one of the first things that struck me was just how these militias emerged so rapidly in response to ISIS, back in 2014.
Yeah, it was really a spontaneous reaction to the threat from ISIS.
Right. The Iraqi government was really struggling to contain ISIS's
Oh,
advance.
absolutely. They were completely caught off guard.
And so these groups that we now know as the Popular Mobilization Forces, or
The
PMFs,
PMF.
they kind of emerged organically, almost out of necessity.
It was a grassroots movement in many ways.
And what's interesting is the scale of it. Over 100,000 fighters,
Yeah.
from all these different factions, like the Badr
Militia
organization,
organization, yep.
Asa Ibal al-Haq Hezbollah brigades.
All very different groups with their own histories.
Right. And so given Iraq's history, the sectarian tensions that have existed there for so long, how do you see the emergence of the PMF in that context?
Well, I think it's crucial to understand that the PMF's formation wasn't just a purely military response.
Okay.
It was deeply rooted in the fears of Iraq's Shia community,
Right.
who saw ISIS as an existential threat.
Yeah, I mean, ISIS was incredibly brutal.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Their ideology, their tactics were terrifying, particularly for Shia Muslims.
Just it was a matter of survival almost.
In many ways, yes, they felt they had to defend themselves.
And so the PMF emerges out of that fear and that need for self-preservation.
And that created this very complex dynamic that we're still grappling with today.
Yeah, the article paints a pretty vivid picture of the front lines. While the Iraqi army and international coalitions focused on retaking these major cities like Mosul,
Right, the big battles.
these Shia militias were heavily involved in these smaller towns and rural areas where the fighting was really intense.
They were often on the front lines in those areas.
Absolutely. And there's a specific example. The article highlights the battle for Beji, which was a crucial turning point in the fight for this oil
Oh,
refinery.
yeah, Beji was strategically very important.
And these militias fought alongside the Iraqi army and really showcased their combat effectiveness.
They proved to be very effective fighters, absolutely.
Right. So it kind of challenges this notion that they were just a secondary or, supporting force.
It's more complicated than that, for sure.
But and this is where things start to get, I think, a little bit more complicated. There's also a darker side to this story. The human rights abuses, the allegations against some of these militias, particularly towards Sunni civilians.
That's an important point and something we have to address.
People who were caught in the crossfire.
Yes, unfortunately caught between ISIS and these militias.
And the article specifically mentions the situation in Saklawiya, where over 600 Sunni men were allegedly kidnapped by the Hezbollah brigades in 2016.
That's a very serious allegation, and it highlights the potential for these groups to commit abuses.
Right, and so I think it's a stark reminder that victory in war, even against a group like ISIS,
Sure.
often comes at a price. And understanding that price is really, I think, vital for assessing the long-term impact of these militias.
Absolutely. We have to look at the full picture, the good and the bad.
So how do you see these allegations impacting Iraq's efforts to rebuild, to reconcile after ISIS?
It's a difficult question, and these allegations, even if we don't have all the details yet, point to a very real potential for resentment and distrust.
Right, that's going to be a big challenge going forward.
And the Investor article really emphasizes that the fight against ISIS was never black and white.
Yeah.
So while the PMF played this crucial role, their actions may have also fueled those very sectarian tensions they were trying to combat.
Right, so it's almost this cyclical thing,
Yes, very much so.
it's very difficult to see a clear path toward unity and reconciliation in that kind of environment.
It's going to be a long and complicated process for sure.
And then we get to the question of power. because these militias didn't just disband after ISIS was defeated.
Right. They're still very much a force to be reckoned with.
They've become entrenched in many parts of the country,
That's right.
and they wield a lot of influence.
They do.
In the article, it talks about how they function as almost parallel security forces in some areas.
Like in Diyala province, for example.
Right, they run checkpoints, they control territory, they even influence local governance.
It's a significant amount of power.
And so that raises a really crucial question. Can the Iraqi government, which is already weakened by years of war and corruption, can they really control these groups?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. And from your perspective, what are the implications of this for Iraq's stability?
Well, it's a situation with a lot of potential for things to go wrong.
Right.
You have these heavily armed groups with their own agendas and the government trying to assert its authority.
Yeah.
It's definitely a recipe for potential instability.
It seems like a very precarious situation.
It is, and I think it's essential for anyone trying to understand Iraq today to appreciate just how complex and how potentially volatile this situation is.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. I think we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot more to unpack.
So let's take a quick break and we'll come back and dive a little deeper into these issues in part 2.
Sounds good. Yeah. It really is a paradox in a way.
Yeah.
These groups, they rise to defend the country, and now they're seen as a potential threat to its stability.
Right, and that's what makes this situation so challenging. There are no easy answers, and the article points to a few key challenges the Iraqi government faces in dealing with these militias.
Yeah.
And one of them that keeps coming up is the influence of Iran.
Right. Iran's involvement is a huge factor here. You can't talk about Iraq without talking about Iran.
No, absolutely. And the article explicitly states that, Iran has supported many of these Shia militias.
Oh, yeah. They've provided funding, training weapons.
It's not just material support, though, right?
No, it goes much deeper than that.
There are these ideological and religious ties between Iran and certain groups.
Deep ties that go back centuries.
So it adds a whole other layer to this situation.
Absolutely.
I mean, it seems like the Iraqi government is in this really tough spot.
Yeah, they are.
Trying to assert their authority over these powerful armed groups, but also trying not to provoke Iran or further destabilize the region.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
So how do you see this dynamic impacting Iraq's ability to manage these militias?
Well, it makes it incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they need to establish control.
Right.
But on the other hand, they have to be mindful of Iran, a powerful neighbor with its own interest in Iraq.
Absolutely. And then you have the internal divisions within Iraq itself.
Yeah.
These militias are predominantly Shia.
Right.
And while they were instrumental in fighting ISIS,
They were.
their actions also alienated a lot of Sunnis.
Absolutely.
It creates a real problem when you're trying to promote national unity.
It does. It sows further division.
How do you bridge that gap?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. How do you rebuild trust when you have these powerful armed groups operating outside of the government's control?
It's a monumental task, and I think it requires going beyond just the militias themselves.
Okay, so tackling the root causes.
Exactly. You have to address the underlying issues that allowed them to gain power in the first place.
Like what specifically?
Well, we're talking about political marginalization, economic inequality, a lack of trust in the government to provide security and justice for all citizens.
Right. So these are deep-seated problems.
Very deep-seated.
Yeah.
And they need to be addressed if Iraq wants to move forward.
So let's talk about the future then. Where do these militias fit into the picture?
That's the big question.
Can they be part of a solution, or are they inherently part of the problem?
I don't think the Investor article offers a clear-cut answer.
Oh, okay.
It really highlights the complexity of the situation.
Right. There are no easy answers.
Exactly. But it does suggest a few possible scenarios.
So what are some of those scenarios?
Well, one idea is full integration into the Iraqi security forces.
Okay, bringing them under government control.
The thinking is that by doing so, they can be regulated, held accountable, prevented from acting independently.
That sounds reasonable on the surface, but how realistic is that?
It's a good question. These groups, they have their own commanders, their own ideologies, their own goals.
Right.
Would they be willing to give all that up?
Yeah, to submit to a central authority.
And even if they were, could the Iraqi government actually control them effectively?
That's a big if.
There's a real risk that they would retain a lot of their autonomy even within the security forces.
So it could almost create like a state within a state.
Exactly, a very dangerous situation.
So full integration may not be the answer. What other options are there?
Well, another idea is gradual demobilization and reintegration into civilian life.
Okay, so offering incentives for fighters to disarm, providing job training, education, things like that.
The goal is to break the cycle of violence,
Hmm.
give people a different path.
It sounds more sustainable long term.
It does on paper, but again, there are challenges.
What kind of challenges?
It would require enormous resources, political will,
Mm-hmm.
and a commitment to addressing the grievances of these fighters, many of whom see themselves as protectors of their communities.
Right, not as a threat to the state.
Exactly. And convincing them to lay down their arms won't be easy.
It seems like the future of Iraq really hinges on the fate of these militias.
I think that's fair to say.
The choices they make
And the government's ability to manage them effectively.
will determine whether the country moves towards stability or falls back into conflict.
The Investor article really emphasizes that interconnectedness.
Of everything.
The political landscape, the security situation, the social fabric, it's all intertwined.
And any solution, if there is one.
Has to take that complexity into account.
Absolutely. All right, so much to think about. We're going to continue our deep dive in part 3, where we'll explore some potential paths forward and discuss the role of the international community.
It's a crucial aspect of the story that we need to examine more closely.
It's really interesting to me, as we get further into this material, how there are so many unintended consequences in this situation.
Yeah.
You have these groups that formed with this very specific goal, defend our communities from ISIS.
Right.
And they succeeded in doing that.
They did.
But in that success, they gained all this power.
Right.
And now that power is creating new challenges for Iraq.
It's a classic case of the law of unintended consequences. You try to solve one problem,
Right?
and you end up creating another one.
It's a reminder that even actions taken with the best of intentions can have these ripple effects.
Absolutely.
And that power dynamics can shift in ways that you don't anticipate.
It's a lesson that we see playing out again and again throughout
And
history.
yet, speaking of unintended consequences, the article really doesn't shy away from the role of the international community in all of this.
Oh, no, not at all.
The war against ISIS, it wasn't just Iraq's fight.
It was a global effort.
There were multiple actors involved. You had the U.S.-led coalition. You had Iran. You had various regional powers.
Everyone had a stake in the outcome.
And the article points to the responsibility of those actors.
Right.
To really address the challenges that have emerged in the aftermath of the conflict.
It's not enough to just defeat ISIS and then walk away.
It seems like there wasn't enough attention paid to the day after.
Yeah, the focus was so heavily on the military victory that not enough thought was given to what would happen next.
How do you manage these forces that have been unleashed,
And now the international community is having to deal with the consequences of those choices.
We're seeing these concerns about human rights abuses, the growing influence of Iran, the
Right.
potential for a resurgence of sectarian violence.
All very real and very serious concerns.
So given all of this complexity, what can be done? I mean, does the article offer any potential paths forward?
Well, it doesn't lay out a step-by-step plan,
Okay.
but it does emphasize the need for a multifaceted approach,
Okay.
one that addresses both the immediate security concerns and the underlying political and social issues that have fueled the conflict.
So tackling the root causes again.
It's not enough to just treat the symptoms you have to address the underlying disease.
But those are really difficult problems to solve.
Oh, they are very difficult. We're talking about political marginalization, economic inequality, corruption, lack of trust in state institutions.
It's a tall order.
It is a very tall order. But the article stresses that it's crucial if you want to achieve lasting stability.
It's like we were saying before.
Right.
You can't just disarm the militias.
Right.
You have to address the reasons why they formed in the first place.
The conditions that allowed them to flourish.
If you don't do that...
You're just setting the stage for new groups and new conflicts to emerge.
So what would that look like in practice?
Well, it would involve creating a more inclusive political system,
Okay.
fostering economic development that benefits all Iraqis, strengthening the rule of law, ensuring accountability for human rights abuses.
All of that while navigating, a complex regional landscape.
Right.
And contending with the influence of these powerful external actors.
It's a tremendously challenging situation, no doubt about it.
But does the article offer any hope?
Well, it does suggest that there's a growing recognition both within Iraq and internationally
Okay.
of the need to address these challenges.
So maybe that's a starting point?
And that recognition could potentially create the political will necessary to make some progress.
So it's not entirely a hopeless situation.
Not necessarily. It's complex and it's challenging, but it's not hopeless.
I think that's an important takeaway, that
Yeah.
the future of Iraq is still being written.
Right.
And the choices that are made now by the Iraqi government, by the international community,
And by the militias themselves.
will determine what that future looks like.
It's a critical moment in Iraq's history.
This has been a really insightful deep dive.
It has.
You know, we've uncovered a lot of information,
We have.
but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, there's so much more to explore.
The story of Shia militias in Iraq is really, I think, a microcosm of the complexities and contradictions of the Middle East.
It really is.
This region where history and religion and politics and power are all constantly intersecting.
And clashing.
It's a reminder that there are rarely easy answers
Or quick fixes.
in these kinds of situations. It's about understanding the nuances, the competing narratives, the potential long-term consequences
Right.
of actions that are taken in the name of security or ideology.
Thinking about the big picture.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question that the article, I think, raises implicitly.
Okay.
What does it truly mean to achieve lasting peace and stability in a country like Iraq?
That's a profound question.
A country that has endured so much turmoil and violence and division,
It's a question that we should all be asking ourselves.
not just about Iraq, but about so many other places in the world.
As informed citizens, as members of the global community.
We need to be thinking about these things.
Absolutely.
And as we continue to learn and engage with these complex issues,
Yeah.
I think it's vital to approach them with empathy
With a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
and a commitment to seeking solutions that prioritize human rights and justice for all.
Those are the guiding principles we should be striving for.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We encourage you to continue exploring this topic, seeking diverse perspectives, challenging your own assumptions,
Right.
and using your voice to advocate for a more peaceful and just world.
Because ultimately that's what it's all about.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here.